Hi everyone. In this video we're going to be working on how to evaluate trigonometric angles when they're in radians. So this video will only be discussing how to work with radians. So the first thing you need to understand is, well, how do I even work with this? Well, there's steps. And before we get to steps, we really have to understand how to work with cosine, sine, tangent, and its reciprocals. And then remember, reciprocals just mean flip it. So like x, you're going to flip it and you're going to get 1 over x. That's all this side is. So what does this even mean? Well, the first thing we need to understand is cosine always corresponds with x. Sine always corresponds to y. And tangent is also known as sine over cosine. Well, remember, sine was y, cosine was x. That's why you see y over x. And secant is the reciprocal of cosine. Cosecant is reciprocal of sine. And cotangent is reciprocal of tangent. Now, as a student, everyone's pretty much going to remember these three. And the way you remember cosine and sine is like this. If you look at the coordinates, you have x comma y. Usually almost everything in math is always alphabetical. So x comes before y. That's the reason when we're working with trig, cosine comes before sine. And it's super important to understand that. That's the reason that x goes with cosine and y goes with sine. Think of it as alphabetical. X before y, c before s. So we'll be really good at this, and tangent we'll just know because it's y over x. Then you have to know the reciprocals. Tangent goes with cotangent. So anything that happens to cotangent, you have to understand what tangent is first and then just flip your answer. And that's what I did here. Sine goes with cosecant. Cosine goes with secant. How are we going to memorize this? Well, the one way I memorize it is since they're opposites, I know s goes with c and c goes with s because they're opposites. So whatever x is, you flip it, you get 1 over x. Another way you can memorize it is like this. Cosine, look at if I were to change this to an O. If you read this backwards, if this was an O, it'd be COS, and that's what cosine is. And that's a different way. All you need to do is just figure out one way that you can remember that cosine reciprocal is secant, sine is cosecant, tangent is cotangent, and you'll be fine. So after you know this, you have to know the unit circle. Knowing this unit circle is key to your success in being able to work with angles. Well, the first thing that you have to understand is you have to memorize the first quadrant. You have to know this first quadrant. You have to know this is pi over 6. You have to know this is pi over 4. And you have to know this is pi over 3. It's just memorization. And the one that goes with pi over 6 is square root 3 over 2, 1/2. My favorite, the one that goes over pi over, the one that goes with pi over 4 is radical 2 over radical 2. Why is it my favorite? It's the easiest to remember. And the last one, pi over 3, it's 1/2 comma radical 3 over 2. You just have to understand that. If you notice, every single denominator has a 2, so don't really focus on memorizing that it goes over 2. Now, how are you supposed to memorize this? Because this is key to your success in solving. You have to know this. You have to know this goes with that. You have to know that goes with that. And you have to know this goes with that. One way I kind of figured out is look at the numbers in the first one. If you were to multiply 3 times 2 gives you 6. Okay, look at the next one. 2 times 2 gives you 4. Now the only problem is this one, 1 times 2 doesn't give you 3, but maybe it adds to give you 3. So if you kind of see that pattern, stick with it, use it. You have to be able to recall that 6 goes with radical 3 over 2. 4 goes with radical 2 over 2, and 3 goes with 1/2, therefore the other one's the opposite. So how do I go from the first quadrant to the second quadrant? Well, one thing you should know is everything is symmetric. And what I mean by symmetric is this. This is going to go with that one because it's the same distance. So because of that, this coordinate is going to be 1/2 comma radical 3 over 2. This one goes with that one, the middle goes with the middle, so this is going to be radical 2 over 2 comma radical 2 over 2. And the last one, symmetric again, so it's going to be radical 3 over 2 comma 1/2. But you have to know the radians. So since this is a 3, this also has to be a 3, except now it's going to be 2 pi over 3. So this is a 4, this is also going to be over 4, except it's 3 pi over 4. Since this is a 6, this is also going to be a 6, except it's 5 pi over 6. And then you may be saying, well, how do I know this? How do I know this? How am I supposed to memorize that this is 1 less? That's your hint right there. Every numerator in second quadrant is 1 less than the denominator. And that's how you memorize it. So anytime you're evaluating angles and you see that your numerator is 1 less than your denominator, it's in quadrant number 2. And if you look at the pattern, every single that has a 3, same coordinate. 4, same coordinate. 6, same coordinate. Well, how am I supposed to memorize this one? Well, remember, everything is symmetric. So since this point is symmetric to this point, this is going to have radical 3 over 2 comma 1/2. And the radian is going to be 7 pi over 6. This middle, this goes with this middle. So it's radical 2 over 2 comma radical 2 over 2. The radian is going to be 5 pi over 4. Maybe you're seeing a pattern. Symmetric, symmetric. This is going to be 1/2 comma radical 3 over 2. And then it's going to be 4 pi over 3. Now the one thing that we're going to do at the end is the sines. But the sines are the easiest. And the last one is, how am I supposed to know this one? Remember, this is symmetric to this one. Or you can go, this is symmetric to this one. So you can kind of go with this pattern. 1/2 radical 3 over 2. Radical 2 over 2 comma radical 2 over 2. And then the last one is going to be radical 3 over 2 comma half. But you got to figure out the radians. This is 4 pi over 3. This is going to actually be 5 pi over 3. This is going to be 7 pi over 4. And this is going to be 11 pi over 6. So this was one less. Well, what about this one? Look at all your numerator and denominator. One more. So anytime you notice that your numerator is bigger than your denominator by 1, it's always going to be in the third quadrant. Now the last one that you have to kind of understand is this one. This one's a little tricky because if you look at it, it's 3 and 5, 4 and 7, 6 and 11. This actually is 2 times minus 1. 3 times 2, 6, minus 1 is 5. 2 times 4 is 8, minus 1 is 7. 2 times 6 minus 1, 11. And the last thing is, what about the signs? Well, we know everything in quadrant 1 is positive because it's in quadrant 1. Positive x, positive y. What about this one? This is actually negative x, positive y. So anything in the second quadrant that's 1 less is always going to be negative x. Third quadrant, everything is negative. Negative x, negative y. So you got to make sure all your signs are negative. And the last one, positive x, but a negative y. Okay? And it's super important to understand that if you know that in radians, you're going to be fine. Now, the ones we haven't discussed is, what about these axes? Well, we know this is 0 because it starts off as 0. And if you go a full circle, it's 360, but 360 is 2 pi in radians. This right here is a right angle. That's the reason why it's pi over 2. This one is pi because it's half a circle. And lastly, this one is 3 pi over 2. Okay? So you have to understand this. You have to know these, and these coordinates are just 0, 1, negative 1, 0, and the last one is 0, negative 1. You have to just know those quadrants, but you have to be really good at this. So once you know this entire thing, from top, knowing what cosine belongs with, and then knowing the unit circle and radians, you're going to be great at this. So how do I work with this? How do I know this? You have to remember, anything that goes with 6 is radical 3 over 2, half. And look, every 6 radical 3 over 2, half. Every 6 radical 3 over 2, half. Every 6 radical 3 over 2, half. You have to know that. 4 radical 2 over 2, radical 2 over 2. 3 1/2, radical 3 over 2. What's one way of memorizing it? 3 and 2 gives you 6. 2 and 2 gives you 4. And this is kind of like the oddball, but if you add them, it gives you 3. Okay? So let's go ahead and look at the steps. The steps in solving trigonometric angles are just 3 steps. What's the coordinate? What is my denominator so I know what the coordinate's going to be? What quadrant is it in? Is it 1 less? Is it 1 more? Is it 2 times minus 1? Because that's going to help me figure out the signs. And the last one, which trig function is it? Is it sine? Is it what for y? Is it, if it's cosine, is it x? Is it tangent y over x? Or is it a reciprocal? So those are the 3 steps that you have to do. So let's go ahead and do an example. Example 1 says cosine 2 pi over 3. Okay, so my first step is, what is the coordinate? So I'm looking at this denominator. The fact that it's a 3, remember, which ones multiply or add up to give me 3? That was 1/2, radical 3 over 2. Okay, perfect. So step 1 is complete. Step 2, find the quadrant. Find the quadrant by looking at the numerator. 1 less, 1 more, 2 times minus 1. It's 1 less, so that means it's in quadrant 2. Well, quadrant 2 means that negative x, positive y. So now I know my negative goes to my x. And the last step is, which function is it? Is it x? Is it y? Is it sine? Etc. Cosine, remember, cosine goes with x. So all I care is about the x. So my answer to this is -1/2. And it's just 3 steps that you have to follow. So then we get to example 2. Okay. First step, find the coordinate. Look at your denominator, 3. Okay, I know 3, that's the one that adds up to 3, so it's 1/2, comma, radical 3 over 2. Step 2, what's the quadrant? Look at your numerator, look at your denominator. 1 more. 1 more is quadrant 3. So that means that it's going to be -x, but also -y, so they're both negative. Last step, sine. Which one is that? Is that x? Is that y? Sine is y. So it's negative radical 3 over 2. And that's my answer. Example 3. So as you're doing this, pause the video so that you can try it on your own and then see if you're right at the end. First step. What's the quadrant? What's the coordinate? Since it's a 4, that's the one that multiplies the 4, so that's square root 2 over 2, comma square root 2 over 2. Step 2, find the quadrant. Since it's 1 more, that means they're both going to be in the third, which is they're both negative. And the last step, which trig function is it? Tangent's the one that's y over x. So y, x. So negative radical 2 over 2 over negative radical 2 over 2. But what is negative radical 2 over 2, comma negative radical 2 over 2? Technically, this is the same thing over the same thing, and this is negative over negative, so that's going to give you 1. And that's your answer. So example 4, step 1 is a 6. I know anytime it's a 6 is going to be the one that multiplies, so that's radical 3 over 2. 3 times 2 is 6, comma half. What quadrant is it in? It's 11 pi over 6. It's not 1 less, it's not 1 more, so it's 2 times -1. So that means that if it's in quadrant 4, remember, if it's quadrant 4, positive x, negative y. Positive x, negative y. Cosine is which one? X or the y. Hopefully you said the x. So it's radical 3 over 2. And that's your answer. So hopefully you guys are seeing the pattern. And if you are, it's amazing. We're going to do 4 more, some of the reciprocals. And then we'll be done. Secants. So when you see secant, first off, secant isn't really in a unit circle. That's why you have to understand which one goes with secant. And the way I memorize it, there's 2 ways. One, remember, change this to an O, you have cosine. So you know for sure this goes with cosine. So what you're always going to do is you're going to convert this to cosine first, evaluate cosine, and then flip it at the end, because remember, reciprocal is flipping it. So I'm going to do cosine pi over 3 first. Okay. Well, remember 3, that's the one that adds up to it, so 1/2 comma radical 3 over 2. What quadrant is it in? It's not 1 less, it's not 1 more, it's not 2 times -1, it's actually just 1. So it's in quadrant 1, which means everything's positive. And then cosine x or y, hopefully you said x, so this is going to equal to 1/2. But a lot of people leave this as your final answer, but that's not true, because remember, we weren't solving for cosine, we were solving for secant. So then what do we do to get to secant? You literally take this and you flip it. Just flip it. And that's going to give you 2. And that's what secant of pi over 3 is equal to. So whenever you see a trig function that's a reciprocal, solve the reciprocal first and then just flip it at the end. Cotangent. Well, for cotangent, I don't want cotangent. I know cotangent goes with tangent. And that's one of the ones that are easy to memorize because they kind of sound the same. So then first is, what's the coordinate? Since it's a 4, that's the one that multiplies the 4, square root 2 over 2, comma square root 2 over 2. And then the last thing is, what quadrant is it in? You see how it's 2 times -1, 4 times 2 is 8, -1 is 7. Quadrant 4, that means a positive x, negative y, positive x, negative y. And then remember, tangent was y over x. So take your y, take your x, and put them over each other. So it's going to be negative square root 2 over 2 over positive square root 2 over 2. And when you simplify this, this cancels out with this, but there's a negative, so this gives you -1. But then you got to remember, you're not solving for tangent, you're solving for cotangent, so what am I going to do with this? I'll put it as a fraction and then just flip it. And if I flip it, I'm still going to get -1. And that's what cotangent is equal to. Okay. Sine pi. Well, you look at it and you're like, well, there's no denominator for that. And that's true. So that means that this angle is one of the quadrantal angles. So you got to memorize, this is 0 or 2 pi, because remember, 0 if you start and 2 pi if you do a full circle. This is 90 degrees, so it's pi over 2. This is half of a circle, semicircle, so it's half of 2 pi. pi. And then this one, don't forget, is 3 pi over 2. So then you're like, okay, well, I found pi. What was the coordinate for pi? And this is just something you have to memorize. Negative 1 comma 0. Then sine is what? X or y? Hopefully you said y. And what's y? 0. And that's what sine of pi is. So for our last one, cosecant. You look at it and you're like, okay, well, I don't want to solve cosecant. But I know I can graph sine 5 pi over 6. How do I memorize it? C opposite S. S opposite C, and they go together because they're opposites, reciprocals. Look at my denominator, 6, so I know my coordinate is the one that multiplies to that, so it's radical 3 over 2 comma half. What quadrant is it in? You see how it's 1 less? So 1 less is quadrant 2. So quadrant 2, that's negative x, positive y. And then sine is my y, so my y is half. But you got to remember, you're not solving for sine. What are we solving for? Cosecant. So what am I going to do with this answer? I'm going to flip it. And cosecant of 5 pi over 6 is 2. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how we solve trigonometric angles. There's just 3 steps that you have to focus on. You have to know, step 1, find the coordinate. Step 2, find the quadrant. Step 3, which trig function is it? And how do I do this? You have to memorize that anything that has a denominator of 6 is this one. 4, this coordinate, 3, this coordinate. And then you have to memorize, is it 1 less, is it 1 more, or is it 2 times minus 1? And if you know that, you're going to be fine. And I wish you all a lot of success and luck for it. And let me know how this video went. Thanks.